Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take a monumental stack of sources articles, legal briefs, news reports, and internal notes, and really try to extract the vital knowledge, the critical context, and all those surprising connections.
Yeah.
You shared a collection of materials covering an event that just ripped through the country, the fatal shooting in Minneapolis, an incident that was, it was simultaneously a local tragedy, a constitutional crisis, and a national political explosion.
It's an absolutely critical deep dive because the event we are examining isn't some kind of aberration. It's the direct structural outcome of an unprecedented concentration of federal force just colliding head-on with an already anxious community.
Right.
And to really grasp the severity, we have to start with the sheer scale of the operation that provided the backdrop,
Yeah.
what was ominously dubbed Operation Metro Surge.
And that scale is truly staggering. So here's the first essential nugget you need to hold on to. We are talking about up to 2,000 federal agents and officers reportedly deployed to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area.
2,000.
For context, we've seen federal involvement in cities before, but officials, including ICE Acting Director Todd Lyons, immediately characterized this as the agency's largest immigration enforcement operation ever.
And when you inject that kind of immense concentrated force, 2,000 armed, specialized federal personnel into a densely populated urban environment where political tensions and local frictions were already sky high, you haven't just initiated a police action.
No.
You have, by definition, created a structural tinderbox. That environment is the unavoidable context for the fatal confrontation that took place on January 7, 2026.
So our mission today is to meticulously unpack how all these forces converged. We're going to navigate two completely irreconcilable versions of reality surrounding the death of U.S. citizen Renee Good.
Completely irreconcilable.
We will scrutinize the figures involved, the victim and the agent, trace the critical seconds of the encounter through all this conflicting video evidence, and finally, analyze the extraordinary legal and political fallout that turned this local shooting into a national crucible for the debate over federal power.
It really is a profound study in contested history, where the truth of what happened in those 2 or 3 critical seconds is obscured not just by chaos, but by immediate aggressive political spin from both sides.
Okay, let's unpack the foundational structure of the deployment itself, Operation Metro Surge. To truly understand the atmosphere on January 7th, you have to recognize the federal government didn't just send a few extra patrols.
No, this was saturation.
They saturated the city. The administration itself defined this operation by its scale. Up to 2,000 officers, described as the largest immigration operation ever carried out.
And we really need to zoom in on the composition of this immense force, because it dictates the goals and the methods. Your sources clearly delineate the agencies involved, which is crucial.
Right.
Roughly 3/4 of the deployed personnel came from ICE's enforcement and removal operations. Let's just call them ERO. ER is the arm that executes arrests, detention, and deportations. The remaining personnel were drawn from Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, which is the investigative wing, generally focusing on complex criminal networks, fraud, and human smuggling.
And that split ERO focusing on the more typical immigration arrests and HSI focusing on organized crime and fraud, that's the key distinction that set this whole operation apart and really ramped up the local fear, wasn't it?
Absolutely. President Donald Trump had repeatedly linked the surge publicly to major fraud cases, specifically involving federal nutrition and pandemic aid programs. And many of the individuals implicated in these high-profile fraud cases were part of the area's massive Somali community, the largest in the entire U.S.
So you have this dual-pronged approach happening on the ground.
Exactly. So while the ERO agents were maintaining a generalized, very visible presence, the HSI agents were reportedly going door to door, investigating these targeted fraud allegations, human smuggling, and unlawful employment practices.
So this dual focus meant that the entire community, regardless of their status or their involvement in any kind of fraud, felt targeted by federal enforcement.
Right. Whether it was the deportation arm, ERO, or the investigative arm, HSI, everyone felt like they were under a microscope.
And we also need to note the involvement of personnel from U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP. Specifically, a Commander Gregory Bovino was part of this deployment. Why is his inclusion significant here?
Well, CMDR Bovino's presence acts as a kind of signal of intent. His tactics in previous, similarly high-profile federal operations in other cities, often involving this aggressive assertion of federal authority into local urban spaces, had already drawn intense scrutiny.
From who?
Particularly from civil rights groups and local elected officials who felt that these federal operations were deliberately provocative. His involvement basically suggested this operation was going to prioritize aggressive assertion over any kind of community relations.
So that visible, aggressive show of force, I mean, the sheer number of agents, the mixed agency composition, the notoriety of figures like Bovino, that is precisely what created that tinderbox.
It is.
Local reporting highlighted that immigrant rights groups and local elected officials noted a sharp, observable increase in the federal law enforcement footprint.
And this wasn't subtle policing. The sources describe federal agents' vehicles making these really conspicuous traffic stops and, mass sightings near busy community centers, businesses, apartment buildings.
Yeah.
It created this constant sense of surveillance and fear.
And the local sentiment quickly spiraled into genuine terror, didn't it? St. Paul City Council member Molly Coleman was quoted as describing the day as unlike any other day we've experienced.
Wow.
And she stressed that every single person is on guard and afraid. This wasn't just political disagreement, it was community paralysis.
And this fear wasn't unfounded or, purely political. Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara, the city's top cop, had previously gone on record criticizing federal agents operating in the city for using questionable methods in past confrontations.
So this friction wasn't new. This wasn't born from this incident.
No, this was a pre-existing structural conflict between the local police, who value community policing, and federal agents who are focused solely on rapid apprehension and enforcement.
Wait, so the city's own top cop saw this coming for weeks. Chief O'Hara even remarked after the shooting that the tragedy was entirely predictable.
Entirely predictable.
That isn't just friction, that's a structural breakdown. What specific methods did O'Hara previously criticize that made this event feel so inevitable to him?
He was particularly concerned about the federal tendency to initiate these high-risk vehicle stops for, nonviolent administrative immigration violations, often in dense urban traffic.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
It creates extreme danger for bystanders and almost always leads to escalation rather than de-escalation. The high visibility and the aggressive tactics, Chief O'Hare argued, basically guaranteed a violent flashpoint.
And that leads directly to the heavy political framing we saw from the state level. Governor Tim Walz was extremely blunt, characterizing the federal surge as a war that's being waged against Minnesota.
Yeah, that's strong language.
And he directly accused the federal agents of being there for a show of cameras.
And this language is key. The situation was polarized from the very start. You had the federal government viewing the local community and its officials as hostile obstacles to federal law enforcement.
And on the other side.
And the local government viewed the federal agents as an invading, occupying force. It was a massive political maneuver masquerading as a standard enforcement action, and the groundwork was laid for violence.
We've established the city was a tinderbox of tension. But to understand how it ignited, we have to look at the two individuals who converged on Portland Avenue that morning, the victim and the agent. Let's start with Renee Nicole Good, the woman who was fatally shot.
Her personal story completely destabilizes the federal narrative that immediately tried to paint this confrontation as an encounter with some kind of dangerous criminal element.
Right.
Renee Good was a 37-year-old U.S. citizen. She was a mother of 3, a 6-year-old from a second marriage, and 2 older children from a previous relationship in Colorado Springs.
And her life story itself was one of recovery and rebuilding, wasn't it?
Yes. Tragically, her second husband had passed away in 2023. She was a poet, a writer, an English teacher who had graduated from Old Dominion University. She had recently made the move to Minneapolis from the Kansas City area, specifically to restart her life, seeking a new beginning.
So, by all accounts, a functioning, contributing member of her community.
Absolutely.
And crucially, and this cannot be overstated, she was definitively not an immigration target. Multiple authoritative sources, Senator Tina Smith, Representative Ilhan Omar, Attorney General Keith Ellison, city leaders, they all confirmed she was a U.S. citizen and had no reason to be targeted by ICE enforcement or deportation efforts.
And this is a fundamental contradiction. The entire operation was theoretically geared towards immigration enforcement and large-scale fraud, yet the person killed was a U.S. citizen.
And local officials like Omar and Ellison, they immediately characterized her presence as that of a legal observer, right? That she was monitoring the federal actions in her neighborhood.
That's the term they used, yes, a legal observer.
That makes sense given the palpable tension that you described in part 1. I mean, if agents are suddenly visible and aggressive in your neighborhood, documenting their actions becomes a local necessity.
It does. However, your sources also note a degree of complexity there. Her ex-husband, while stating she was deeply compassionate and hated injustice, also expressed some doubt that she was a long-time established activist.
So her intentions might be a little more complicated.
Right. Regardless of her specific intentions, she was observing the operation near her home, driving her vehicle just moments after an intensely routine domestic act. She had just dropped her 6-year-old son off at school.
That detail. It makes the subsequent tragedies so incredibly jarring.
It does.
Now let's turn to the other central figure, Agent Jonathan Ross. He was identified through court records by the Minnesota Star-Tribune, although the federal government has meticulously avoided confirming his name publicly.
Which is a key part of the lack of transparency here.
Exactly. So what do we know about him?
What we know about Ross is that he is 43 years old and possesses an extensive, highly specialized military and law enforcement background. He is an Iraq War veteran who had served in the Border Patrol and ICE for nearly 2 decades. His ICE tenure dated back to at least 2017.
And his training level is what sets him apart from a standard street officer.
Precisely. His background isn't that of a typical patrol officer. He was a firearms instructor, an active shooter instructor, a field intelligence officer, and a member of the St. Paul Special Response Team ICE's equivalent of a SWAT unit.
Wow.
This level of training suggests he was highly specialized and prepared for high-stakes, violent force situations, which makes the debate over his split-second judgment even more intense.
But the defining characteristic of Agent Ross in this context isn't his training, is it? It's the traumatic prior incident that occurred just 6 months before the Good shooting.
Yes, the crucial prior incident from June 2025. This history wasn't just background noise. It was immediately pulled into the foreground by federal leaders to construct an ironclad defense for his actions of the Good shooting.
Okay, so what happened in that incident?
In that previous St. Paul apprehension, Ross had approached a suspect in a vehicle. He reportedly smashed the car window and reached in to unlock the door, only for the suspect to suddenly drive off.
And what happened to Ross in that encounter?
He was violently dragged approximately 100 yards, it's about 45 meters, before he was finally thrown clear of the vehicle. He sustained a serious injury, requiring 33 stitches, and the suspect was later federally charged with assaulting a federal officer with a dangerous weapon.
So he was literally dragged 100 yards and seriously injured. I mean, that trauma is real, regardless of the legality of his initial attempt to reach into the car.
Oh, absolutely.
So how did the federal defense structure their argument around that psychological wound?
It provided them with an instant, powerful psychological and legal defense. Vice President J.D. Vance and Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem immediately leveraged this history, arguing that Ross was, hypersensitive to the threat of a vehicle being used as a weapon.
Right.
They claimed that when Good's car moved toward him, his previous trauma provided an objectively reasonable belief under federal legal standards that his life was in imminent danger. They were arguing his action wasn't reckless. It was a deeply ingrained, split-second defensive response to a threat he had experienced firsthand.
So it effectively, preemptively addresses the question of whether he should have perceived the threat differently. It allows the defense to pivot from the immediate facts of the January 7th scene to the agent's prior justifiable fear.
Exactly. It creates an almost instant psychological immunity. It establishes that for this specific agent, in this situation, any sudden forward movement by a vehicle was a deadly threat, regardless of what other officers might have perceived. This contextual history is paramount to understanding the federal position.
This brings us to the core event that defines the entire controversy: the fatal encounter at 9:37 a.m. CST on Portland Avenue. The sources provide a meticulous timeline, down to the second, which really underscores how quickly this entire scenario unfolded.
Okay, let's reconstruct the prelude. Renee Good's maroon Honda Pilot was stopped diagonally in the street. Her partner, Becca, exited the vehicle at 9:36.51 and immediately began filming an agent on her phone.
Which shows the level of caution and awareness already present about the federal deployment.
Right. Agent Ross, the eventual shooter, moved to the front left side of Good's car.
What were the last words exchanged before the confrontation escalated?
Good spoke directly to Ross, reportedly sounding calm, saying, "That's fine, dude. I'm not mad at you." Her wife, Becca, was less calm. She engaged Ross verbally, saying things like, "You want to come at us? I say go get yourself some lunch, big boy."
So there's some verbal antagonism from the passenger side, but that's a long way from a deadly threat from the driver.
It is. Then multiple ICE agents approached the Honda, which was stopped sideways in the road, creating an obstruction. Agents repeatedly ordered Good to get out of the car, but this is where the command structure completely fractured.
What do you mean?
It was complete chaos. One eyewitness account specifically claimed agents were giving conflicting orders.
Yeah.
One agent was shouting commands at Good to drive away and clear the roadway.
While another was shouting at her to get out of the car.
Exactly, shouting at her to stop the vehicle and get out.
If that confusion over drive away versus get out is true, doesn't that fundamentally undermine the claim that Renee Good was willfully weaponizing her vehicle or resisting a single, clear, lawful command?
It absolutely undercuts the argument for willful resistance. If she is receiving contradictory, shouted commands from different federal officers, drive away to clear the road, stop and exit the car, she is responding to an environment of total command confusion, not malicious intent.
She was essentially trying to navigate an impossible high-stress situation.
Yes.
And then we enter the terrifying 2 to 3 second shooting sequence. At 9.37.32, the action culminates. Agents are near the car and Good makes her final move.
She first put the car in reverse, briefly, moved a few feet, almost a twitch, and then immediately began driving forward. The key piece of evidence, analyzed by multiple sources, is that she turned the wheel to the right.
So she's steering the vehicle away from Agent Ross.
Away from him. He was positioned near the front left fender, and she was turning away.
Her wife yelled, "Drive, baby, drive!" And in that fraction of a second, Agent Ross reacted.
The ABC News timeline confirms the speed. In under 1 second of elapsed time, Ross drew his weapon and fired 3 shots into the car as it passed him. The car continued forward for a short distance, hit a parked vehicle, and crashed into a light pole.
The immediate reaction from federal authorities was a massive, aggressive narrative push. The claim, issued by DHS and quickly reinforced by President Trump and VP Vance, was that Good had weaponized her vehicle.
Right, committing an act of domestic terrorism by attempting to run over federal officers, forcing the agent to fire in self-defense.
This narrative is built entirely on the premise that the agent was facing a deliberate, deadly attack.
It is. But the analysis of the video footage tells a far more complicated story, one that is largely rejected by local officials and external experts. Mayor Jacob Frey called the federal self-defense narrative bullshit, to use the source's raw language.
Let's dive into the detailed video analysis, because this is where the legal battle lives. What did major news organizations conclude?
The analyses from reputable sources, the New York Times, the BBC, and the Washington Post, all corroborate that Good was fundamentally attempting to leave the scene. Witnesses confirmed that she posed absolutely no threat at all, noting that there was ample room to drive forward and away from the agents without hitting anyone.
And specifically regarding Agent Ross's position, the New York Times analysis was crucial, wasn't it?
Yes. The NYT analysis corroborated that Good was steering away from the agent as she accelerated. However, there was a point of contention regarding physical contact. Some reports, notably from CNN, initially suggested the car may have clipped Ross.
But others disputed that.
Right. Others found that claim inconclusive. But what is undisputed, however, is that Ross remained upright and on his feet throughout the entire encounter. He was never knocked down, never visibly struggling to escape the vehicle's path.
So this clash between the official federal statement that the agent was run over and the visual evidence of the driver steering away from him is the central pivot point of the national controversy.
Absolutely. If she was driving away, the necessity of deadly force is severely challenged.
And that challenge is compounded by Agent Ross's own cell phone video, which DHS eventually released through a conservative news site. Ross, a highly trained tactical officer, was filming the entire encounter on his phone.
Yeah.
The image of a trained tactical officer with a gun in one hand and a cell phone filming in the other completely scrambles the idea of proper training. I mean, what kind of threat assessment is that?
It completely undercuts the official defense of a desperate life-or-death split-second decision. Criminology professor Jeff Alpert publicly stated he wanted to see the training manual that permits holding a gun in one hand and filming on a cell phone in the other.
Right.
He questioned whether such an action could ever be justified in a deadly force scenario.
So what's the implication of filming while drawing a weapon? What did the experts say?
Well, policing experts like Professor John P. Gross argue that holding a gun in one hand and filming with the other complicates an already volatile situation, and, critically, suggested that if the officer was casually filming, he could not have truly perceived Good as a deadly threat.
You don't casually film a situation where you believe in that fraction of a second you are about to be run over and killed.
Exactly. The dual action suggests a degree of control, distance, and confidence that contradicts the imminent threat defense.
And on top of that, the video itself isn't even clear evidence for the federal claim.
No, it's flawed evidence. When Ross fires, the force of the weapon discharge causes the cell phone camera to jolt violently toward the sky. It completely fails to visually capture any alleged contact between the car and the agent.
So the agent's own video, which was presumably intended to prove his defense, fails to visually substantiate the claim that he was being struck or run over.
That's right. And beyond the visual evidence, the audio captured on Ross's own recording adds another distressing layer that contradicts the professionalism you'd expect.
What was on the audio?
Seconds after the shots were fired and the car had crashed, a male voice, audible on Ross's recording, was clearly heard saying, "Fucking bitch."
Wow.
This unprofessional, inflammatory remark further fueled the perception that the agents were operating with a high degree of aggression and a lack of restraint, not just objective self-defense.
Finally, we have to look at the immediate aftermath and the medical response, which was deeply, deeply criticized.
The agents' actions immediately after the shooting created further political and ethical fallout. ICE agents reportedly refused to permit a bystander, who identified himself as a physician, to provide medical aid.
They refused medical aid from a doctor on the scene.
They did, stating that first responders were already en route.
That refusal is shocking, especially in a critical, life-threatening situation. How long was the delay?
The delay was significant in terms of survival time. It took a full 6 minutes for EMS and firefighters to arrive at the scene. 8 minutes elapsed from the time the first shot was fired until Good was finally receiving CPR.
8 minutes.
She was subsequently pronounced dead at the Hennepin County Medical Center. This refusal to allow immediate, qualified bystander aid, whether it was dictated by policy or just poor judgment, significantly hampered the community's perception of the agent's conduct and priorities.
The moment those 3 shots were fired, the confrontation moved from the street into the halls of government, pivoting into a massive legal and investigative showdown.
It did.
Initially, Minnesota state officials expected a standard collaborative investigation.
That's right. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the BCA, they handle high-profile police use of force cases under state law. Their joint involvement with the FBI, the federal investigative arm, was the logical and expected step for transparency.
But the U.S. Attorney's Office quickly squashed that. They reversed course, as the sources put it, and informed the BCA that the investigation would be led solely by the FBI.
Effectively locking state investigators out.
Completely. BCA Superintendent Drew Evans stated his agency was denied access to case materials, scene evidence, or investigative interviews, forcing them to reluctantly withdraw.
And that immediate and complete federal lockout drew immediate fire because it ensured that the only entity investigating the use of deadly force was another federal agency.
The agency investigating the agency being investigated?
Precisely.
Governor Walz immediately called this maneuver a breach of trust, saying Minnesota must be part of this investigation, arguing that independent oversight is essential when the potential for civil unrest and political volatility is this high.
And the federal government countered by asserting that because Agent Ross was a federal officer engaged in federal immigration enforcement, the subsequent investigation fell exclusively under federal authority. They argued that any state interference could compromise national security operations.
So this lockout sets up this crucial battle for accountability at the state level. Despite being shut out of the crime scene and evidence, Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty asserted that her office still has jurisdiction to make a charging decision,
Which is a huge deal.
regardless of the agent's federal status, and confirmed they were exploring all options.
This is a direct challenge to the federal claim of legal immunity. While the federal government asserts power, state legal precedent often dictates that even federal officers are subject to state homicide laws, provided the state can acquire the necessary evidence.
But that's the key, right? Provided the state can acquire the evidence.
It's a courageous stance from Moriarty, but it immediately highlights the massive asymmetry of power.
And recognizing that they were blocked from official channels, Moriarty and Attorney General Keith Ellison had to get creative. They appealed directly to the public.
And this is the visual proof of that power imbalance.
Yeah.
You have the state authorities, the county attorney, and the attorney general essentially crowdsourcing their murder investigation, publicly asking residents to submit any videos, photos, and eyewitness accounts they had.
Because they have nothing else.
The only entity with full access to the agent's phone footage, any potential body-worn camera footage, and the forensic evidence is the federal government itself. The state is operating blind.
Now, let's pivot to the legal standards, because this is the bedrock of the federal defense. Agent Ross's defense rests entirely on the Supreme Court precedent of Graham v. Connor.
This is the single most important legal concept for our listeners to understand. Graham v. Connor, decided in 1989, provides the standard for judging all police use of force. It requires that force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene,
A reasonable officer on the scene.
making split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving.
Okay, so what does that mean practically for Agent Ross?
It means that if Agent Ross, considering his training, his history with that prior dragging incident, and the immediate chaos of conflicting commands and a moving car, if he genuinely felt his life was in imminent danger, then his use of deadly force could be deemed objectively reasonable.
So the court has to avoid what they call the 20/20 vision of hindsight.
Exactly. They can't ask if he should have done something different. They must ask if a reasonable officer in that specific second would have perceived the threat the same way.
So even if the video analysis proves the car was actively steering away, if Ryan reasonably believed his life was threatened because the vehicle was moving rapidly toward him or past him, he could be exonerated.
That is the immense legal protection granted by Graham v. Connor. The federal defense hinges on establishing those three crucial elements: tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. By citing the prior injury, they bolster the tense and uncertain elements, arguing that this specific officer had heightened sensitivity to the threat.
And we also have the specific DHS use of force policy layered on top of Graham v. Connor.
Yes. The DHS policy clearly states that deadly force cannot be used solely to stop someone who is fleeing. That prohibits shooting someone just to prevent an escape.
But there's a loophole.
There's a critical loophole.
Yeah.
Deadly force is allowed if the vehicle is used in a manner that threatens to kill or seriously injure an officer or another person, treating the car as a deadly weapon. The federal government's use of the term weaponized her vehicle is a direct invocation of this policy and legal standard.
And this all clashes fundamentally with the modern policing philosophy that local departments, including Minneapolis PD, attempt to follow.
It presents a fascinating contrast in enforcement philosophies. Minneapolis Police Chief O'Hara stated explicitly that city police departments train to avoid creating situations where deadly force becomes necessary, especially when there is no underlying serious criminal threat. Their focus is on de-escalation.
That difference is massive. Local police training prioritizes tactical withdrawal and containment, letting a vehicle go if pursuing it creates more danger than the offense warrants.
Especially if the underlying crime is a nonviolent administrative one.
Exactly. The local standard suggests a duty to de-escalate. If an agent is in front of a car driven by a U.S. citizen who is not the target of a serious criminal investigation, local doctrine would suggest backing away to defuse the situation rather than attempting to physically stop the vehicle, which almost guarantees a violent outcome.
But federal immigration enforcement, particularly in the context of this massive surge, seemed to prioritize immediate apprehension and assertion of authority over tactical disengagement.
That's the structural critique. The federal agents seemed less concerned with de-escalation and more with the rapid, aggressive assertion of their authority in a tense environment.
And when you combine that aggressive posture with the immense legal latitude provided by the Graham v. Connor standard, you create a perfect storm where an officer's split-second fear, even if objectively disputable, is likely to be legally upheld.
The very nature of the operation, a massive surge targeting administrative violations and fraud allegations, makes the use of deadly force against a non-target U.S. citizen during an alleged nonviolent fleeing attempt seem completely disproportionate.
It does.
Even if it's legally protected by the federal standard.
It brings into sharp relief the conflict between what is legally reasonable for a federal officer in a tense situation and what is publicly justifiable in terms of community safety and proportional response. The law and public morality are operating on entirely separate tracks here.
The legal complexities were immediately swept up in a tidal wave of political fury. The shooting acted as a massive catalyst, confirming the worst fears of local officials and instantly escalating the tensions of Operation Metro Surge into a national political crisis.
The local government's response was, it was unprecedented in its intensity. Governor Walz, already incensed by the surge, ramped up his rhetoric, calling the federal action a war that's being waged against Minnesota.
Wow. And he demanded ICE leave the city immediately.
And he backed that demand with a serious preparation for unrest. He took the highly unusual step of putting the Minnesota National Guard on standby, a warning order, to be ready to prevent widespread civil unrest.
Which demonstrates the severity of the threat he perceived.
Absolutely. He also proclaimed the following day a day of unity, in honor of Renee Good, consciously framing her death as a political symbol of federal overreach and a tragedy requiring community solidarity.
And Mayor Jacob Frey went even further, using language that shocked many but resonated deeply with the local community, publicly demanding ICE get the F out of Minneapolis.
That raw emotion is so telling. When he was later questioned about his inflammatory language, Mayor Frey defended his choice unapologetically. He said, "I'm so sorry if I offended their Disney princess ears, but here's the thing if we're talking about what's inflammatory."
And what was his point?
He said, on the one hand, you got someone who dropped an F-bomb, and on the other hand, you got someone who killed somebody else.
That Disney princess ears comment is jarring, but it perfectly captures the extreme emotional chasm between the local officials who felt they were protecting their citizens and the federal administration, which they felt was acting as an invading force.
And the local consensus was unified against the federal presence. City Council member Jason Chavez openly called for Agent Ross to be arrested and fired, going so far as to urge residents to patrol our neighborhoods to prevent what he called the kidnapping of our neighbors.
Which reflects the immense generalized anxiety over the federal authority and the perceived risk of arbitrary arrests.
Right.
The federal response was an equally forceful defense and a counterattack designed to seize control of the national narrative.
Vice President J.D. Vance was relentless in his immediate defense of Agent Ross. He described Good's death as a tragedy of her own making, essentially blaming the victim, and labeled her a victim of left-wing ideology.
And he rejected state oversight entirely.
Completely. Arguing the officer was under attack and had every reason to believe his life was threatened, citing that prior June injury as necessary context.
This is where we need to return to the rhetoric. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem reinforced the administration's stance, citing the June 2025 injury and, crucially, characterizing Good's actions as an act of domestic terrorism. Using domestic terrorism, that seems like a massive rhetorical escalation. How does that framing fundamentally change the public perception compared to, say, suspect resisting arrest?
It elevates the confrontation from a law enforcement incident to a war footing. Labeling it domestic terrorism is designed to eliminate any need for nuance, de-escalation, or accountability. It instantly casts the victim as a malicious political operative rather than a citizen making a poor judgment call while trying to flee a scary situation.
So it transforms the agent from a suspect in a shooting into a hero fighting terrorism.
Exactly. It provides maximum political cover and justifies the original aggressive deployment.
And Secretary Noem proved the federal administration was not deterred by the fallout. She announced a subsequent Operation Salvo, increasing ICE presence in New York City.
This was a clear political signal. The strategy wasn't changing, it was doubling down. They were leveraging the Minneapolis controversy to justify more aggressive enforcement nationwide.
Right, and Attorney General Pam Bondi also weighed in.
Yes, issuing a stern warning to protesters not to obstruct or attack federal law enforcement, saying, "Do not test our resolve." This was the federal government asserting dominance and daring the local resistance to escalate further.
The resulting community disruption and protests were massive and nationally resonant. Hundreds gathered immediately at the scene and converged on the Whipple Federal Building, which serves as the ICE headquarters.
And the situation rapidly turned confrontational. Federal officers deployed chemical agents, pepper balls, and pepper spray on crowds outside the federal building, mirroring tactics we've seen in previous controversial federal deployments in other cities.
And the incident near Roosevelt High School truly terrified the local community.
It did. There were alarming reports of federal agents chasing a vehicle near Roosevelt High School grounds, tackling people, and even assaulting a staff member. This proximity to children and educators significantly deepened the fear.
And led to widespread, immediate consequences for civilian life.
Oh, yeah. Minneapolis public schools and Fridley public schools canceled classes for the rest of the week due to safety concerns, with MPS later offering remote learning options well into February. The State Educators Union demanded ICE stay away from Minnesota schools.
This just shows the immediate disruptive impact on civilian life, which far exceeded any disruption caused by the alleged fraud the operation was intended to address.
And the outrage wasn't contained to Minnesota. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson immediately drew national attention by comparing Good's death to the Silverio Villegas-Gonzalez case in his city, where the federal government had also initially claimed a driver tried to run over agents before video evidence contradicted that account.
So it became a national pattern.
It did. Good's death prompted protests in dozens of cities nationwide, including New York, Portland, and Washington, D.C., demonstrating a shared national concern over federal enforcement tactics and impunity.
And the level of public empathy was massive, too. A verified GoFundMe set up for Good's family quickly soared past $1.5 million before being closed, showing the strong public support for the narrative that she was a victim of federal overreach, not an act of terror. This deep dive into the Minneapolis shooting reveals a fundamental, irreconcilable conflict, not just between local and federal government, but between two wildly divergent and intensely marketed accounts of reality.
That is the essential takeaway. On one side, you have the official federal narrative, defined by self-defense against domestic terrorism, a split-second decision against a weaponized vehicle, underpinned by the agent's traumatic prior history and protected by the legal shield of Graham v. Connor.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have the local consensus, the witness accounts, and the independent video analyses suggesting a tragic killing during a confusing attempt to flee, where the driver was actively steering away from the agent.
The critical legal battle, which the listener must follow, focuses entirely on that Graham v. Connor standard. This standard grants immense, almost unassailable legal leeway to federal officers, prioritizing the subjective perception of the agent in a high-stress moment over post-incident forensic clarity.
And that standard is being applied in an investigation led entirely by the federal government. The FBI, after the Minnesota BCA, was explicitly locked out of access to critical evidence.
Right.
This lack of independent local transparency contrasts sharply with the public demand for accountability. The state is effectively trying to prove murder with crowdsourced videos and eyewitness testimony, while the federal agency controls the forensic evidence, including the agent's own video. It makes the pursuit of state-level charges incredibly difficult.
So we end with this final provocative thought for you to consider.
Yeah.
Building on the profound disparity between intent and consequence, Operation Metro Surge was explicitly initiated to address large-scale fraud allegations, often tied to federal aid programs.
Right.
Yet the first and most explosive consequence was the fatal shooting of Renee Good, a U.S. citizen and legal observer who was not a targeted subject of the operation.
So what does that outcome tell us about the actual inevitable trade-offs and consequences when immense, aggressive federal power is unilaterally injected into an already tense local community under the banner of enforcement?
Was the true underlying goal apprehension of alleged criminals? Or was the ultimate, predictable result the assertion of political dominance and the creation of a high-profile, volatile confrontation?
That is a question the courts may address legally, but the community has already answered politically.